this third session of week 7, we will talk about how Korean Americans came to dominate sushi business in America by looking at their demographic and historical backgrounds. Between 1970s and 1990s, a lot of Koreans migrated to the United States of America. And actually, during this short time period, Koreans were probably the biggest in terms of Asian migrants to America every year. And as you see in this image on the graph or chart on your right, today, among all Asians in America, the Chinese are the biggest group, and then Filipinos, and then Indians, and Vietnamese, and then Koreans and Japanese, so that order. But 1970s and 80s particularly, the Koreans were, I believe, slightly more than Indians. But anyway, Koreans, a lot of Koreans migrated to America between 1970s and 1980s and until mid-1990s, which means a lot of Koreans came to America, and many Koreans have a highest rate of self-employment in the US. Why? Because there are many reasons. Koreans probably were the worst in terms of their English language capacity. Among Asians, the Indians and Filipinos, their English is superb, and that's why these ethnic groups in America, they dominate government jobs and public jobs and so on. But Chinese, not so good in English, but Koreans are definitely the worst. Not because the Koreans are less linguistically talented, but simply the linguistic distance from where English is spoken in England and Western Europe and Korea, the distance is so far. So both Koreans and Japanese are normally, they are the lowest in terms of their English capacity until recently. But today, of course, a lot of young Koreans, they study overseas, and they invest so much time and money in learning English, so their English is super. But anyway, we are talking about 1970s and 80s and 90s. And many of these Koreans, they were looking for self-employment opportunities in American society. And for Chinese, opening Chinese restaurant might be a good option. But unfortunately, in 1970s, 80s, and also even 90s, Korean food was not that popular in the mainstream America. And that's why Koreans had to look for any alternative business opportunities. And the opportunities came at that time when increasing demand for sushi was happening. And also at the same time, Japanese migrants to America virtually stopped after 1960s. Now Japan became prosperous. Not many Japanese would get out of Japan to immigrate to US. And that's why the Japanese population in America, they were rapidly aging. And especially the first and second generation Japanese, they wouldn't, the next generation, second, third generations, they would not inherit their parents' Japanese restaurant. Because by second and third generation, the new generation became highly educated and they all become professional. Why should they continue to run their shabby small Japanese restaurant that they inherited from their parents? Now, this lack of Japanese migrants, growing demand for sushi gave tremendous opportunity to Korean migrants of the time. So again, as I said, in Japan towns, Japanese people were aging, and next generation would not continue the old restaurant that they inherited from their parents. And also, Koreans were continuously increasing in terms of number through 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And also, Korea's economic growth, which means that these new migrants who came to America, especially after 1980s and 90s, they were able to bring some capital from home. And so now this capital would be used for them to establish self-employment. So normal pattern is the first Korean immigrants, when they come first, they would start very cheap, small grocery shop. And then they would open small restaurants. When they have more capital, then they would open bigger restaurants. Or eventually they would move, many people move to laundry factory, large scale dry cleaning shops, which requires much bigger capital, but also which results in much bigger profit. So this was the pattern for Korean migrants. And as I said, 1970s, 80s, that was a peak of Korean migration to America. And Koreans, unlike Chinese, they knew how to make a kimbap, the rice roll with cooked vegetables, beef, and egg strips. Now this they learned during colonial period. Kimbap was an invention from during the colonial period, learning from the Japanese makizushi, possibly. We don't know very clearly, but it was during this time that kimbap became available widely in Korea. So, because Koreans knew how to make a kimbap, which is very simple, anyone can make a kimbap. All you need is just some sheets of kim or nori and cooked rice. You pour it onto the nori, and then you just throw anything you have and roll it, cut it, voila, you have a kimbap. It's such an easy thing to do. And elsewhere in this lecture series, I already mentioned about Vietnamese banh mi sandwich, which has some similarities with in the process of invention of kimbap. Anyway, now also so many Korean migrants came to America, and many of them actually worked at Japanese restaurants, especially the teppanyaki performers, like Beihana teppanyaki chain restaurants throughout America. Many of the performers in the restaurant were Koreans. So Koreans, there were large number of Koreans who knew how to run Japanese restaurant in America. And also there was some training schools set up in Koreatown. And in this image on your right, at the top is a few years ago, I took that photo in Seoul, a very nice kimbap store. So you see all kinds of sophisticated kimbap. And then below was, I took this photo year 2004 in Los Angeles, Koreatown. And it is called Tokyo Sushi Academy in Korea. So that means that's a school where you learn, as a new migrant from Korea, you learn how to make Japanese sushi. And their course is only about 4 weeks. 4 weeks of time, paying $3,000 at that time, you learn more than 120 different kinds of sushi and Japanese food. So it's a very quick process of learning. And this is one of the most successful, big Korean sushi bar. And this particular one is in Florida. And you see that at the top it says sushi bars, Japanese. And then somewhere you see Korean as well. So normally this big Korean sushi bars, often they sell sushi. They focus on sushi, but they also deal with some Korean food. Not all, but some. And these are also from Vancouver, Canada, year 2004. I was walking on the street, and you see at the central Vancouver, you see this jari sushi, and it says Koreana with Korean national flag symbol at the center. So this is definitely something Korean, but they sell sushi. And on your right, this is another suburb in Vancouver, and I found this sushi bar, and the name is Jacko Restaurant. And I immediately knew this was owned by Korean. Why? Because that Jacko, what is Jacko? That's Japan, Korea. Okay? So interesting name. And Japanese people, when they name their restaurant, they would never put such a name as Jacko, or that's because it's not Japanese at all. So I decided to count just how many Koreans were engaged in sushi business in Los Angeles. So I checked Los Angeles Koreatown directory, and in 2003 version, there were more than 150 Korean-owned Japanese restaurants appear listed in that directory. And so that means at least there were 150 Korean-owned Japanese restaurants in Los Angeles, Koreatown. I'm not talking about beyond Koreatown, but Koreatown itself and vicinities. And when I returned to Auckland in New Zealand, I also checked the old Auckland, New Zealand Korean advertisement. And in the central Auckland city, I figured out there were at least 20 Japanese restaurants, which are mostly sushi bars in downtown Auckland, and at least more than half of them were owned and operated by Koreans. So this tells us the scale of the Korean-owned sushi bars in North America and countries like New Zealand and Australia, and even in Europe. In our fourth session, we will talk about outside of America, where Koreans operated and owned Japanese sushi bars, in Europe and in Oceania.